This is our final panel, which will ask the question, who owns the countryside? So we've got three speakers now. So Denise Felkin is an editorial and fine art documentary photographer who collaborates with communities to share their stories that speak out about current issues, reveal a truthful voice, and promote sustainability, unity, equality, inclusivity, and compassion. Denise will share the photo essay Insight, of which she's brought copies of her book along, to reveal a glimpse of an underground lifestyle with roots in new traveller communities. Jermaine Francis is a lens-based artist and photographer whose work visually explores our relationship to space and the historical, social, and cultural narratives. Jermaine's talk will consider landscape belonging and historical narratives in visual culture, discussing a historical lineage that has been part of the discourse for some time. One which can cover race, class, economics, culture, and political issues, where issues that are siloed as being the urban environment also are issues in the rural experience. And then Andy Thatcher, who is currently finishing a PhD exploring common land through lens media, whose research has taken him to Newcastle, Switzerland, and Norway, with a long detour through folk horror. Andy's talk is about the different ways we might think about common land, along with its history, its importance to local and marginalised communities past and present, and the threats it faces. So, over to Denise.
Hello. I'm going to be talking about my project Insight, which I responded to the open call for PhotoFrome, and it's on display at the Station Gallery and the zine at Frome Library, and there are some copies for sale here. And I will be leaving swiftly at 4:30 because I have a train to catch. But the project, well, I'll just read my Instagram that I wrote after I came here 3 weeks ago for the preview, and I wrote, "A wonderful night at PhotoFrome of preview of inequality. I love the way Insight is positioned with the tree and the crow that was on the wall before they hung the exhibition. True to the nature of the traveller's site I photographed, with a damson tree and birds that sang in the garden." First of all, I'm going to do a disclaimer. I do not consider myself as a traveller, nor have I lived in the countryside. I grew up in a small town in the Midlands, and at the bottom of our road there was fields. And in those fields there was horses and cows, and we was allowed to ride the horses under supervision, of course. And then the area would like flood over, and we'd kind of wade through all the flooded water in our wellies, and then when it froze over in the winter, we'd kind of ice skate on it on our wellies. Today, it's a road, it's a complicated one-way system. So that's probably my connection to the countryside, because it was like a slice of the countryside at the end of my road. We had a lot of fun playing over there as children. I lived in my parents' home for the first 19 years of my life. Since then, I've had a count, and I've rented 21 homes in my life. That includes 3 universities within 8 cities and towns within the UK. This does not include anything to do with any international travel. My project is about a traveller's site in London, and my connection to it is the fact that I did live on this traveller's site for 5 years, and I had a friendship of 17 years with the protagonist. You'll hear me call several names as titles of my images, but his name was Simon, and he passed in 2023. And I'll tell you more about that as my story goes on. Unknowingly, this project started in 1997. I'd moved to Brighton to study at the university, and it was mid-1990s, and I met my badass friend Zoe. She told me she was adopted and her birth mother was a one-armed gypsy seamstress. I lived in a rented flat, and Zoe lived in a trailer on a traveller's site on the fringe of the town. She came to my home often, and I let her use my bath because for her, living on council wasteland had limited access to sanitation. A few years later, Zoe was pregnant, living in her trailer in the UK and unable to settle, as the convoy she travelled with was under constant threat from the police. They felt unsafe dealing with daily violence, fines or imprisonment for their itinerant way of life. It got so detrimental that Zoe and her partner moved to a bricks and mortar flat to nest. I painted Zoe a bold, vibrant picture inspired by the self-expression of the Falvism, and I titled it Off-Site. The scene set within trees is viewed from an outsider's point of view to represent her new phase. The caravan depicts a thin shell of protection from the external elements, and the trees symbolise life cycles where the wood provides shelter, warmth and heat. 17 years later, I visited Zoe in her own home in Devon. She'd hung off-site on the dining room wall. Ironically, at that time, I lived in a trailer in East London, and the acrylic on paper depiction looked just like my caravan home environment. An alternative lifestyle is documented, citing the unjustified discrimination against travellers and gypsies faced since the draconian I can't get my words out. This is why I put this slide in. It's really hard for me to read this fluidly. So where am I? So different Public Order Acts, 1994 to 2022, were introduced into British politics, which aim to destroy an energetic youth culture. Dubbed by News, which that was in the mid-90s an independent news agency in Brighton, as poll tax on acid, the bill set out to eradicate unlicensed public festivals that grown from the 70s flower power counterculture. Many of the free festival revolutionaries were environmentalists who were also involved in anti-nuclear protests. In June 1995, 1,300 riot priests charged into a grass field off the A303 near Stonehenge. Innocent people were truncheoned, seriously injured and homes destroyed in what was coined the Battle of Beanfield. And then there was a series of public order acts that followed, 1985, 1986 and 1992, which included criminal sanctions against the assembly of outdoor unlicensed music events, unauthorised camping, squatting and aggravated trespass. So the number of vehicles that could be in a convoy was set out 12, and then 1986 to 6 caravans could only be together at that point. And then in 2022, the police gave power to ban travellers from an area for up to 12 months, alongside powers to fine, arrest, imprison or seize the homes of itinerant people on roadside camps. Last year, I went to visit my friend in Skegness. She rented a caravan there. She was allowed to live there for 10 months a year. There were 45,000 caravans in Skegness. The yard where I lived on in East London, there were 13. I think it's always changing, but there's a maximum of 13 people. That's the most people that actually live there. If you're interested, the caravan on the right-hand side, next to the purple one, is where I used to live for 5 years. Insight reveals a community of unseen images of people who lived on the fringes of society. The images provide a glimpse into underground lifestyle with roots in new traveller communities. Respect, freedom, truth and beauty are conveyed with an unpretentious perception of an urban experience and expression of an urban subculture. In 1998, a book of photographs emerged of new travellers documented by Irish photographer Donovan Wiley. The book unfolds with travellers residing in a lay-by in Gloucestershire and halfway through relocates to East London. There is no colour or emotion, just stark images of nomads flaunting as scapegoats as representation of messed up policies on their right to roam. The afterward, I missed a bit out. Wiley exerts gritty black and white images to portray squalor, drug addiction as an uncanny portrayal of people wanting to live an alternative lifestyle. The afterward text was written by Andrew O'Hagan, who depicts the group as smackheads and victims of society who could not do anything with their lives. Simon cameos in the book. I never actually saw this image until I started writing Insight, which was last summer. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. But so this was discovered while I was in the middle of writing it, after all the photographs had been captured. So the Arch Tatter is captured in full character. He is set amongst much chaos. It is a moment of contemplation as he lights his mate's cigarette. The flickering flame from the light represents a destruction caused by external forces, and the hint of light provides a source of life which refers to his internal warmth, motivation, spark of imagination, and the genius of what was to come. Three years after living in Whitechapel, Simon leased commercial property. There are thousands of rented arches across London. His 3 arches under an overground line include a spacious domain providing a safe place for travellers to live in vehicles. This was the first image. The painting was the first image, but I unknowingly did that. This was the first image shot in this series, and it wasn't set up. It was just literally in a situation which I'd rather not go into the details of, but and I just said, "Oh, that's a really good shot," and I just picked my camera up. So it was not set up at all. Naomi talks very much about light in caravans, and when you was making your talk, I was just thinking, this is totally different. This is a box with no windows in it, and I was quite envious of all your light within your images. And that's kind of a lot of times, because there's 13 of us living in this shared space, that a lot of times we'll keep our curtains closed just to keep, so we wouldn't be viewing each other. So I'm influenced by August Sander. I only mention Simon by name as Simon. That's actually not his real name. So, and I kind of decided that the story was going to be about Simon and about the way he ran the site. So I didn't really want to go into any detail about the other people that lived there too much. Everybody that features in this project has seen it, and I've got their approval from everybody. And this came up in the previous talk, but that's important to me, that when I have worked with communities, that they are happy with what I've done. It's not so much about the audience, it's normally the key workers or the people that are involved. And like I said, everybody's happy with this, and I just literally messaged them all when I'd put it all together. I said, look, I'm making this story, it's about Simon, it's not about you. I want to use this image, and I'm going to title you, and you'll see the titles of each people as I go along. Is this okay? And everybody agreed, and they said when they read the story that I got it right, and they were happy with what I'd written. This is, I know what I'm reading out to you is actually what I have written, but I'm not reading the whole thing to you. So the performer. Gentrification and social cleansing have a history of exploiting working class people banished to the outskirts of the city. It occurred 100 years ago when documentary artist Eugene Atget photographed the Zonias on the edge of Paris. The album consisted of a group of rag pickers and scrap merchants who had set up shanty towns during an era when the French capital went through modernisation. Atget felt much affinity with the people he documented as he lived an itinerant lifestyle in his theatrical days. The Advocate. From the beginning, an agreement was made between me and Simon that these images, or the real story behind them, would not be shared while this particular site existed or the inhabitants had moved on in their lives. It is an unconventional story that the protagonist did not want to be told, captured in an era where the subject, narrative and location were too vulnerable to share with the outside world. The reason why these images have taken so long to surface is as a way of protection from the voyeurism and the journalistic side that could have crushed the DIY development. At the time of making this work in 2012, I was studying an MA in photojournalism at the University of Westminster, and I started photographing them as part of my project work. But the aim of some of the briefs would be to make publishable stories. And because we were all living there, there's no way that I would have wanted this to go to press, and that's why I started to put it together last year, so 12 years later. And I kind of made, when I did submit some of them, I kind of changed the story a little bit, as in more connected to the Olympic Games that just happened in Stratford, which was not too far away. The Welder. The Yard was an empire of freedom, framed as a way of life beyond politics or hierarchy, filled with colourful and dignified characters. Kitchen sink realism is developed with an urban industrial landscape to reveal domestic scenes, creativity and humanism with the hustle and the bustle of the multicultural capital. The people on site were mostly men. They turned by word of mouth from new traveller communities and pitched their customised living vehicles. No contract was signed. New tenants would bung Simon enough to cover a month's rent in advance, and rent fees went by the amount of space each person required. The Magician. In 2010, that's when I moved on, a place to rent a plot of land on this London site cost between £200 and £800 a month. A decade later, the sum doubled. The lease payment consisted of a space to pitch a living vehicle. There was access to electricity, shared internet, a washing machine, a tumble dryer, a hot shower and the toilet. Water could be fetched from a main tap, and there's a drain in the middle of the yard for grey water. Described as like living a festival full time, and set in the playground of cultural London, everything the city had to offer was easily accessible. The Recycler. The territory was a vivid place, continually undergoing cycles of renovation, disintegration and renewal. When a living vehicle had served its purpose, or rats started coming through the floor, the inoperative vehicle would be scrapped for aluminium and weighed in at the local scrap dealer on the high street. Food waste went into a compost heap and other materials went into recycling bins, or commercially rented bins. The site was a greenbelt. It was a slice of countryside in London. So I kind of get off the tube, it's 10 minutes from the tube, five minutes from the overground, and it's literally, you'd come out of crazy, busy tube land, London, etc., and then you'd kind of just walk onto this peaceful oasis. And that's kind of my connection with the countryside of the site. The tenant-in-chief. Simon often said if he lost sight, he would end up on a park bench or prison. In later years, debts accumulated, aggravation came from bailiffs, and he had to use a food bank. He considered moving on to live on a boat on the River Lee. However, in the summer 2023, Simon had a heart attack at home in his bed. At his funeral, his sister asked me, why did he take on such a huge financial responsibility? And I replied, it's because sight was his empire. It gave him a sense of belonging, purpose, and community. In 2024, I went to a portfolio review and I met up with Tony Bell from The Observer, and there's literally about 1,000 pictures from when was I, 2006 up to 2023, less in later years because I wasn't really living there anymore. I was still visiting the place. So I said I showed the whole, I literally put it all on my laptop and I just showed the whole of the 1,000 pictures to Tony Bell in like 20 minutes or something. And he kind of flicked through them and I said, how am I going to put this project together? I said, I've got 1,000 pictures and I just don't know how to, because I'm so close to this project and it's also part of my grief as well. I said, how am I going to put it together? And he kind of flicked through and he said, go for all the pictures with people in them. We're not really interested in all the, because I think I've already said, but it's like, it was a working scrapyard on the face, but it was community living on a working scrapyard. So he said, do you want it as a book or an editorial piece? And I said, both. Well, he said, well, it was an editorial piece, it's got to be 8 images, and I managed to get it into 10 because I thought the painting was important, taken 1997. So, did that, okay, I was teaching at the time, it's that time I'm teaching, I've got a summer off, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write it. And I said, how am I going to write it? And he said, just write it from your own point of view, which is I've just shared with you. So I thought, before I do that, I must go and see what's happening with the land. There might be someone still living there, like Travis still living there. Don't want it, back to that story again, don't want to get it in the press or anything like that if people are still living there. So I decided to go and visit the place. Everything was very, very familiar. I went on the overground, I went to see if I could see it from the overground on the train, but I couldn't see it, all the land was overgrown. I could see the toilet block was still there, which was hopeful, because I really didn't know what to expect. And it's been a year since I've been there. And then I kind of walked down the alleyway, familiar route because I lived there, and I was like, oh, what am I going to see? Is it going to be like a shiny new business? Or are there going to be travellers there and it's like, I don't know them and it might be an unsafe place for me? So as I got closer, I was a little bit nervous because of my grief, and I kind of knew that it could be a trigger for my grief as well. And anyway, I saw this picture or this scene, and I recognised the gate. I was quite relieved. It was the old battered gate that was always, was very familiar with. I noticed that the armhole in the gate was a lot bigger as I got closer. And I kind of looked at the padlock. I knew the padlock and the chain had changed because, when I was there at the funeral, I think someone else would try to take over it or something. And I had my camera already around my neck because I was kind of going to take a picture from the train, but I couldn't see anything from the train was moving too fast anyway. And I looked through the armhole and I just saw this absolutely beautiful light. And this fox just stared at me. And as you know, photographers, took the first shot, setting's not quite right, need to make an adjustment on the camera, made an adjustment on the camera, took the second shot, and the fox never moved. And I kind of thought, I don't need to see anymore. I kind of could see that caravan that was in there, no one was living it because it wasn't horizontal. It was, you know, you can't live in a caravan that's, you know, on a slope. So I thought, that's enough. I'm gonna walk away now, and I'm strong. I'm not gonna cry or anything like that. And because I could have gone around the side, I could have jumped over the wall, but I decided that this was enough. This vision of the fox, and I texted his friend, his best friend after, and I told him about me seeing the fox. I sent this picture, and he said to me in a text message, his friend replied, did you know we had a second funeral for Simon? He said, we got a Meccano truck. He loves Meccano. And we could put his ashes in it and put it on top of an old wardrobe and set fire to it. And he said, maybe Simon is still haunting the place. You remember the story, the fox squatted in the dog kennel and kind of left us at that. So to end this talk, who owns the countryside? I think the answer is actually in that picture.
I would say my work isn't more about who owns the countryside, it's more about the idea of different stories and belonging. So a bit about my background. I'm from Tipton, which Kirsty photographed, which is always quite funny. I have the book, so it's quite funny. And so where I grew up, even though it was a post-industrial town, it was quite easy for me to get to the countryside. So I'd go to Malvern Hills and places like that. So for me, growing up, it was an interesting relationship with the countryside. Well, both my parents are from Jamaica, but they both come from the countryside in Jamaica. My father's really rural. But what was interesting, they didn't really spend time in the countryside in Britain, which was always an interesting paradox for me, coming from the countryside in another place, but not feeling that you could be in nature in the country, but you moved to. I used to go to the countryside because I was in the Scouts. I was a really bad Scout as well. So we used to go camping. But I also did have a feeling of not belonging in those spaces for many different reasons. And in terms of this talk, it's really about the idea of photography and visual culture, but I'll be talking about my work, and I'll be talking about, hopefully in time, Joanna Coates. Joanna and I speak quite a lot, and we have parallels in our work and conversations in our work about this idea of amplification of stories and narratives within those spaces. I studied at Derby in photography, which had a really strong landscape school under John Blakemore and Karen Orr, people like that were working there. I was there in the 90s when I was young. And so I just wanted to take on a little journey, and I'd always been interested in landscape. The problem for me, like say with John Blakemore, whose relationship with the landscape was something very spiritual, I didn't have that same relationship as he had. But John was amazing, and Lynn Silverman, in the sense that they embraced my understanding of the landscape as being different. And so the beginning of that. I'd always been interested in Turner. He's 250 years. Seems a bit oblique, but there's a relationship with the visual culture or visual image of the landscape related to an idea called the sublime, which is this feeling that you would have when you go out into the nature and the wilderness, and something that you can't quite describe. But there's a interesting relationship with that. I mean, I'm showing you this painting because this painting was classed as by Ruskin as the ultimate aesthetic embodiment of the sublime, as a visual image, as well as it comes from both Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant. There is a conversation about this. Is interesting that this is the depiction of Zong, which was a slave ship which threw over the slaves, the black slaves, into the sea for insurance purposes. But Ruskin never talks about what's depicted, talks about the brushstrokes, the aesthetic. Immanuel Kant bases the sublime on his philosophical writings about racial hierarchy, who can feel, who has the intellectual ability to be in the sublime. And also Burke refers to these similar ideas as well. So for me it was this idea of really enjoying nature and the countryside, also being involved in art and visual culture. And what does could the sublime be something for me, or what does it mean to me in these spaces? So I want to show you Karen Nor's Pleasures of Imagination. And Karen's work in some ways takes on those ideas or questioning of this aesthetic or created idea of what the countryside should be or looks like, and you know what I would say also within cities, their experience, people from the cities and experience. There's a lot of ideas from the city of what the countryside is or looks like, which is quite simplistic in many ways. And what I'm thinking about, spaces, narratives, and histories have got plurality to them. They can be two things at once and many things, basically. And some of the things that relate with the urban, or so-called urban sort of kind of issues, also exist within the countryside as well. Class, economics, infrastructure. Anyway, we'll get on to, people have spoken about those things, so I've changed mine slightly. So one of my first interests in terms of photography and art was Ingrid Pollard, and the reason why I've shown her work and Karen's is my work, I see it as part of a lineage. I don't see it as something brand new or something that's part of, but it's part of a conversation, a discourse, a part of this. And this was Pollard's work, and it was the cost of English landscape. And what was interesting with Ingrid's work, a lot of people concentrate on one part of Ingrid's work, which is about the idea of an alienation of the black thing and the relationship, and historical relationship with England and with the landscape and a metaphor for that. But Ingrid also, Ingrid is a walker, a rambler, and this piece of work was really interesting for me because it talks about not just about the idea of herself and identity, but also about issues around the space itself, which other people can relate to, sort of common land ownership, private property. It's also, some of the imagery is photographed near Sellafield in Cumbria, which was also, people remember, was called Windscale. Changed for a reason to Sellafield. So he was talking about these beautiful pastoral images, but also the idea of labour and the land. So Ingrid was really important kind of image maker, artist in that kind of me thinking about those things. So, to me. So a storied ground, as I said, is it's a word that the title's taken from Paul Redman's book, Storied Ground, which talks about how spaces have been used to create an identity, which is mainly based on English nationalism. And, what people think about in the way they talk about Britain usually is actually kind of English nationalist aesthetics and ideas, not the same as Scottish, not the same as Welsh. So, these things I've been thinking about when reading that book. I'd also been thinking about the idea of, and it was when I made this work, it wasn't far after COVID, around COVID. So I'd been thinking about a few things and also talking to young kids, so there's the idea of alternatives. So when I grew up, alternative, especially like where I grew up in Tipton and something like that, when West Midland was seen as something different. But alternative now means a much more layered, there's more opacity, there's more complications to that, it's more rich and big. I wanted to think about what a younger generation who is black thinking about in terms of not just the idea of representation, because there is an idea of black representation which I think can be siloed from both sides. An idea of this kind of opacity, a kind of difference, which I think exists there, and about their place within the rural and the landscape. And so it was an exploration of that. And then also, so these images are montages. And so they are, so this is Rio, photographed in Gloucester. So I went to Gloucester to see Rio. And we spoke quite before about these images and what I was doing. But within the images, there are montages on, the image itself is a montage, the images outside of it is a montage. And what you have is a kind of classicism in the image, which is probably hard to see on there, probably on the other screen. And then there's a young boy with a do-rag who sits in the corner of the image. And Ria and I talk about the poses, and we deliberately posed in the sense of reflection on the painting and the landed gentry. And so we wanted to make that intervention, that insertion, and enhance the dramatic clouds which played with the rural idyll and the pastoral. This image was the image that was used at Norwich Museum as part of the Turner exhibition of contemporary landscapes, and it was placed in relation to Claude Lorraine's painting, which was about classicism and about a time that existed before, which is mythical, but is seen as this kind of idea of a landscape or a rural idyll, which has lasted into which photography is also reflected in some of its landscape photography over the years. I've also loved photography because I'm a bit obsessed by time travel as well. And so like the whole Barthes idea of photography being time travel, but it's something that's of the past that also something that's taken the present but also is of the past, which can also affect the future. I think photography is a very good quality is a really great medium for that kind of quality. And also, I'm not a photographer who, this is not, in some ways, some people ask, is it a documentary photography, is it portraiture, is it landscape? I kind of like the fact that it has this instability of all, and that's why I'm like the idea of opacity and in between. It is a portrait of the people in these spaces that they've picked as well. They decided to be it, but also a dialogue outside that, where it becomes a montage. And then some of it's like is a landscape as well in its format. Donia is from Ireland, and their relationship, it was quite really interesting conversation. So in the Midlands, you would say that West Midlands has been a solidarity with Irish and kind of Afro-Caribbean communities, but their relationship in Ireland, especially in the country and rural, was very different. They did not have that relationship. Idea of acceptance. But that doesn't mean that the space that they enjoyed being in could not still be the countryside and rural. And that's where two things can exist in one. There can be joy and pain, there can be all those things. Let's say in this context, the black experience has always been related to that. A writer called Fred Moulton talks about the consent of being more than a single thing. I think that can relate to a lot of different people, to be honest. The consent to be more than just one single thing. It can be more than that. Ratari. I met Ratari during lockdown, who was basically, he had a truck called the History Van. And so he'd deliver food during lockdown to people who weren't able to basically, go to the shops. And it was usually a lot of like older people, disabled, and he'd drive around in his van. He was at a lot of protests as well. He also put on a lot of the illegal parties at that point as well in a lot of the rural areas. He's an interesting guy, retiring. We spoke about making this image. The other thing that happened when making these pictures, we talked about how they wanted to be, so I wanted to relate to the idea of the text in the document and the title and the name, but I also wanted to speak about how they wanted to be represented in that text. I also talked about that the images I took would also be manipulated in the sense they would be in relation to other images. And so I would show them the montages, because what you're doing is in the montage, you're making a dialogue with one image to the other in order to connote some kind of production of a kind of meaning or something like that. So I want them to understand themselves how they were going to be represented. And if they didn't like it, that's it, we had to go. They were happy with it. For me, that was important because it's them at the end of the day. You know, to be honest, I'm not risking anything. They're the ones who are being put out into the world. That's how I see it. I think as photographers, we do take. And so, but I don't take that as like a knock. I think it's good to think about that as a positive thing, so we kind of take on board what power relationships we have. I think that's good. Good thing. I mean, you know, Kirsty's talked about that in her work. Joanna's talked about that in her work. I think it's a good thing to have those kind of understandings, or at least conversations. Victoria, and so they decided their pronouns. I thought that was an interesting way of also inserting that as a kind of contemporary comment about society and about image making and about landscape. Sade in the English country garden. This was Sade's mum's garden. Sade inherited the house, so there was also a personal connection as well. Wara, who's also Irish, from Southern Ireland. And they were shown in 4 different exhibitions. And what happens is they are actually like boxes. They sit on the wall as like objects in the space as well, and have a dialogue with the space. So it's not just about this absorption of a picture, it's also in relation to where it sits. And that's also in landscape tradition, and then to think about sitting within spaces in the countryside. There was also a projection in the image. I mean, sorry, not in the image, in the space, which was of a couple. It was a projection, but it was actually glitched. So when you sat down, you thought it was going to be a moving image, but it wasn't. It was basically had this kind of strange kind of visual dissonance. And that was also about his comment of absorbing and being voyeuristic, and also about trying to create a visual sensation as well. One which could be slightly uncomfortable for some people. The reason why I probably think about this visual dissonance was also about the idea of the conversations I'd had with a lot of the people who were in this project, about the idea of being in these spaces, and even though we might have been from these places, there was still this kind of unease, some slightly not fitting in. And so that visual dissonance, for anyone who comes into that, who doesn't know that experience, is about being sort of transported into a kind of a sensation, a feeling. And the reason why I'm talking about Joanna's work is because there are similarities in the idea of a sort of an amplification of individuals or figures or people who have not been amplified in certain conversations about spaces or in a rural. Joanna's showing this work, I think, at Frome, Overland. And I'd seen this particular work at the Jerwood when Joanna first showed it, and I was really taken aback. It was really interesting. Using a combination of photography, sound, handwritten diaries, you had the grass button and a video. And I thought it was a sophisticated attempt to present a counter-narrative of the representations of North East. From a working class woman's temporality of lived experience and perspectives in the region. I thought that was super important and super interesting to talk about those layers, those pluralities, those complications. It was basically using diaries and personal objects to choose reflect their identity, their voice, and I thought that was interesting, presenting in not just kind of sort of real terms, but also in a photographic terms as well, historical terms, of trying to present some kind of agency for those people within those images. Amber Mum, model disability activist. I thought the titles were important, those descriptive codes. Again, it's like, mum, not just a mom, but that's just not the singular thing of this woman. There are many different parts to this individual that makes them a person, and not just to be siloed as society does. My experience of the miners' strike. I mean, it was people Tipton itself in the past had mines and it was post-industrial, and one of the first miners' strikes. And it was the basis, but Arthur Scargill based his strategies on this, was a miners' strike which was in Nichols. And so my experience of the miners' strike was also from afar, because I was watching it on TV, and they were in spaces, they were in the north, in Nottingham, place the East Midlands, and the rural. And I think people forget about the women involved in that. We saw a lot of the times the men, we saw Orgreave. We didn't always see the women in that, what happened and what happened to those communities. What was also interesting for me with Joanna's piece was the unseen experience of individuals in those rural communities, the effects under contemporary capitalism, social capital, labour, for those kind of things that go on. I think we talk about these things, especially in relation to cities, but we don't talk about what happens when they affect also countryside and rural areas. For example, if a bus route disappears and people have to rely on cars, what happens when the oil prices go up somewhere else and affect somebody who has a car that is probably maybe from the 90s, but that's being affected. All these kind of conversations I thought were sort of, I'd say, entry points from the work, and in work that's like this. The individual objects, the spaces. One of the things I thought was super interesting when I spoke to Joanna about this work was two things. She was saying that she didn't want to present a nostalgic, singular visual representation of the space. But I thought was also interesting was talking about, because I'm going to be going through the similar process of moving away from a place and then going back in order to sort of work with the people and document a project, which in some ways you become the insider who becomes outside, who returns. It gives a sort of strange kind of perspective, because you're no longer part of that community, even though you came from there and know people there. Your experiences are different. My experiences are different from my friends at home. I work at the Royal College of Art. It's an elite university. My considerations are going to be different from my friends back at home. That's for sure. There's don't have an arrogance there on that, but also an insight. We talked about it a lot, and I thought what was interesting was talking about understanding cultural ways of life and unspoken rules. And what was interesting, whether you agree or disagree with those cultural rules or those kind of qualities in this place, they help you understand how a community exists or was created. I think that's interesting and important, especially if you're someone from the outside. Like I said, I've spent time in the countryside, in Suffolk with friends who had a farm in Gloucester, but I'm not from the spaces. I've spent time, but that's a very different thing than spending the everyday experience. So for me, I thought that was really part of this work that Joanna made was, for me personally, insightful. Thinking about, if we're going to engage with communities, to understand how these particularities work in these spaces, possibly. That is it, short and sweet.
So, I'm going to be talking about my work, photographing and filming and writing about English common land. So commons have been important to me since childhood, and since 2019 I've been studying, photographing and filming them. My hometown has a large common in the middle, and going for a walk on the common is part of family life. In London, I lived on the edge of Epping Forest, while in Exeter I got to know a network of commons known as the Pebblebed Heaths, as a runner, a parent, a volunteer and an artist. Now I'm in Bristol, where every 5 years the university sets sheep out to graze on nearby Durden Downs. How perfect is that? I'm currently in the final stages of a PhD there, in which I'm thinking about how to represent commons, a problem which has only grown as I've learned just how incredibly complex these places are. Because commons are complicated, I'm introducing them first, before talking about my practice. I'm studying historic, traditional common land, and there are many definitions. One which is recognised internationally hinges on a group, the commoners, with some form of right to use land which they either don't own, or don't own entirely, or which no one owns. This group is always specific, say people from a village, or with land bordering a common, and any rights relate to something which they need from a certain patch of land. The common. That thing can be grass to graze livestock, or gorse for fuel, or water from a well, or sand for building and cleaning. Commoners might need access to a riverbank to fish or to land boats, and there is even a common where people from a council estate have rights to hang out washing. Those rights are carefully shaped to stop this resource from being overused. So firewood might be just what you can pick up from the ground or pull off trees by hook or by crook, which is where the saying comes from, or what you can carry away in a handcart. Some commons are seasonal. Old hay meadows might only become commons after the first cut of hay, the foremath, leaving the second cut, the aftermath, again that's where the word comes from, and winter grazing to the commoners. Traditionally, the commoners' interests are represented by a collective council which monitors the common's health, agrees on rule changes and delivers punishments. Far from any lawless free-for-all, as they sometimes get described, traditional commons are an orderly way of managing something for the benefit of those who need it, in a way that responds to change. But nor are they necessarily some utopia. There are hierarchies, and women have been and continue to be excluded in England as elsewhere. That said, access to resources outside of monetary exchange and markets has historically allowed for greater social and economic freedom and localised control of land. England's commons, as with commons everywhere, have their own history and especially a history of their loss. There isn't time to do this history justice, but commons are lost when land gets stripped of common rights and the landowner takes sole control. There are popular perceptions that time existed when the land belonged to everyone, that enclosure began with the Normans and accelerated in the late 18th century with parliamentary enclosures, and that enclosure amounts to the elite stealing from the people to enslave them. There's truth to this, but the history is far more involved. Enclosure was one factor out of many which broke up the cohesion of rural communities, sometimes destroying them entirely, and hit hard on the means to self-subsist, and so made rural poverty worse, especially for women. By the 19th century, remaining commons became increasingly thought of as more valuable socially than agriculturally, and a new right became paramount and legally enshrined rights of access for a completely new use, leisure. Organisations like the Commons Preservation Society and the National Trust began to save them, and Acts of Parliament were passed to better protect them, at least in theory. Because in turning over commons for the national good, autonomy was lost to the people who knew how to care for them best, local people and commoners. But how does this come across visually? One thing I've been struggling with is the landscape value of commons and the expectations that commons are certain kinds of landscape, heathland, moorland, ancient woodland tracts. And yet the grouse moorland of the Pennines is essentially a game-hunting monoculture with questionable public access, while the perimeter of Heathrow Airport is dotted with patches of polluted, blighted, weed-choked, hard-to-get-to riverbank commons with rights for fishing. I've been drawn to the latter, which only a commons nerd armed with an OS Explorer map and a DEFRA dataset would ever come across. I like the weirdness factor in these and other forgotten places, which most people would never guess were registered as common land. By presenting them as commons, they become charged with histories of injustice, repression and resistance, and the many hands which have made their survival possible. I like that they're highly specific, highly local places. Their scruffy neglect and obscurity suggests subversive possibilities for taking these places back, repurposing them for today's communities and today's needs. There are important choices to be made whenever a common could be represented as conventionally beautiful. Wareham's town walls in Dorset are an Anglo-Saxon defence against Viking raids, which still surround the town, and all of which is a common. It is an area popular with tourists, and second home ownership is growing. But it's also an area with a deep history of rural poverty and rural unrest. In these two images, I'm showing the choices I had to make: the green space within the classic English landscape, or the social history implied by the social housing, or at least housing originally built as such. Both images have their value and their contradictions. Commons are loved for their beauty, and that can be enriching for anyone. But beautiful landscapes can also get adopted by nationalist narratives and imagery, something which we've already touched on here. This image of Little Salisbury Hill, inspiration of Peter Gabriel's famous song, implies the hilltop's expansive freedom and is more satisfying as an image. So that's the one on the right-hand side. However, the other one on the left is in some ways a more honest, aware way of representing this National Trust-owned beauty spot, which is also a common. Through obscuring the land itself, the image implies state intervention. The trick point effectively blocks the view and replaces the land with what is ultimately a military-industrial artefact. It excludes the viewer, setting up a contradiction. If we are the nation, and we choose those who govern a nation at the ballot box, and those people make decisions about how our places and spaces are used and regulated, have we forsaken our direct responsibility for them? What power do we have? Whose land is this beneath the trick point? Actually, it's private land. It's the National Trust's. They might be a national body. You might even be a National Trust member, as am I. But it's not ours at all. I've also taken countless images of actual, as opposed to metaphorical, exclusion. I've been fascinated with borders for years, as it's here that conflicts and questions of ownership and rights and legal status become physical. Commons are defined within boundaries, and while legislation largely protects access into them, it also allows access to be restricted from common land into private land, as was this image on the, which you can barely see, on the right-hand side, which is a garden entrance onto a common near Bristol Airport. The other image, which you can see better, is of common land at Portland Bill, which shares its coastline with military installations, and this sets up a paradox. Unenclosed land surrounded by enclosed land, surely a border is a border. The day trippers might wander happily at will outside of the military enclosure, but the savageness of the fence is menacing. Here's another military fence on the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall, one that needs a bit of unpacking. I'm standing on an enclosed public footpath, looking into Prydenic Airfield, leased from its landowner by the RAF. The common land is over where the windsock blows, inaccessible military land used for training and dotted with burnt-out aircraft. And yet look at the downs on a map, and you'll see it has the cheery peach colour of open access land, a legal designation brought in for nearly all common land in 2006. We have a legal right to go there. Whether you can actually get to it, or allowed to get to it or not, is another matter. Here's another paradox, which shows the power of knowledge. This is a footpath in East Devon, which runs across Luppet Common, which is still used by commoners for grazing. What it says is legally accurate. That path is not a registered public right-of-way. But that doesn't mean there's no access, as it's across common land, which has protected rights of access on foot for anyone at any time. That sign is a trace of a conflict, an ongoing one, given that the sign has been shot at and defaced. I look for traces everywhere, and it's often the trace I take a picture of and not the place. The traces on these fences tell a story of resistance against the US Air Force, from when the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp protested against the sighting of US nuclear cruise missiles by camping at the gates to the base. Greenham Common was fenced off in the 1980s to build what was then the largest airstrip in Europe. The women's protests can be seen as simultaneously anti-war, anti-patriarchy and anti-enclosure. The women cannily bought small pockets of land around the common, and when taken to court by the US Air Force, coming up one of my favourite facts ever, for their mass trespasses, the judge found in the women's favour, as they had rights of common. Rather brilliantly, he also ordered that several military buildings illegally built by the US Air Force be demolished. When the site was returned to public use, the nuclear bunkers were designated a historic monument, and so the fences around them have been preserved. What you can see here is the patching and repatching of the fences by the US Air Force after each successive fence breaking by the women. Commons also collapse urban-rural binaries, and I like playing with this in my work. Many urban commons suggest the rural, not just through their semi-wild scrubby woodland or waving grasses, but because there are still practices more frequently associated with rural lifestyles. Little Wormwood Scrubs in London appears to still be used as a stopping place for Roma, as commons have been for centuries, until a 1925 Act extending general public access, but quite deliberately marginalising travelling people. Sometimes this blurring is because an urban area has expanded into a rural area, as at Wormwood Scrubs, but some commons have always been urban. Newcastle's Town Moor is Europe's largest urban green space, a third larger than New York's Central Park. The freemen of Newcastle put cows to graze on a common which borders both wealthy and impoverished areas. It's a contested space, and it's argued that the moor could be used more productively for planting trees or conserving wildlife. Growing usage by an expanding population has put pressure on the livestock, and there are calls to stop grazing entirely following inevitable incidents of charging cows. Here, especially, is the clash between specific local use and general public use, agriculture and leisure. Occasionally, I'm able to accommodate these contradictions into a single shot, such as this one. And this, at a network of common meadows which surround the nuclear reactors at Hinkley Point. But the histories of common land are often historic and abstract, rather than present and physical. Even where histories like the Greenham Common fences can be seen, other histories remain elusive. In any case, a degree of unpacking is needed, and this has been a problem for me, not just as a photographer, but as a filmmaker. I am ostensibly doing a filmmaking PhD, although sometimes I do wonder. My short film, Cluties, uses a fictional storytelling structure which draws together archival ghost story, folktale, calendar custom and social history to explore Groveley Wood, a 2,000-acre common wood near to Stonehenge. It's also one of the nearest bits of common land to here, I notice. It tells the story of a young woman, Grace Reed, sent to Salisbury Prison in 1814 with 3 friends for trespassing to gather firewood from a newly enclosed Groveley at a time of serious starvation. In a dream, Grace is led to the Groveley of 2022, where the ghosts of 4 sisters murdered in the 17th century tell her that her resistance will be remembered in a folk ritual, and that ultimately access to Groveley will be returned to her village. Almost none of this story remains physically, other than ancient trees hung with ribbons to commemorate the murdered sisters. In telling a ghost story and illustrating it with shots of the present-day wood, including repurposing a bunker as Salisbury Prison, I was able to tell a specifically female story of enclosure, phrasing it as patriarchal violence and also of resistance. This shift to the Gothic has revolutionised the way I think about my work and led to my creation of a screenplay, so a complete change of medium, and 3 essays due for academic publication. I've learned almost as much about commons through photographing them and filming them as I have through reading and discussion. I've certainly refined the way I relate to them. Making art has given me the curiosity and licence to explore places I never would otherwise have visited, and so discovered facts and ideas I wouldn't have otherwise come across. Commons are profoundly local places with eccentric characteristics. Their contradictory, complex histories tell of who gets to use the land and how, and so can suggest alternatives. Through photography, I've not just represented all this, but uncovered it. Send it for reading.
That was a fantastic final panel. Thank you so much indeed. Incredibly rich. So many things to draw upon. I really love that phrase, Andy, the idea of sort of the eccentric characteristics of a particular landscape, or a little bit of it. So I think I'm going to steal that at some point, but it's up. We don't have very long for the sort of final part of this session, and it's great to sort of circle back to some things that we haven't kind of fully expanded on sort of previously. And I would really like to open it to questions really from the floor. But the first thing I just wanted to remark on, if I may, is just the real kind of sense of care that comes across. And I think that's been really quite profound, actually, the thoughtfulness that I think everybody really exhibits. Whether that's just in terms of the very sort of subtle titling of an image and thinking about an alias perhaps. Also, as you said, Denise, like just thinking about the passing of time and that kind of enabling sense of anonymity. I think those sort of great lessons for all of us who are kind of making work and interested in showing photography and talking about it. So yes, I'd just like to sort of thank all of you really for setting such amazing examples of best practice and thinking about all of the subjects. So yeah, from there, are there any questions from the floor for anybody in particular, or any observations?
I've got one.
Mark.
It's a lot of the time, I think, what's interesting about photographs is how they look 40 years later, which we may not be around to see. But I'm thinking of the work of someone like James Trevilius. It's fascinating now because that world's vanished, but he didn't necessarily know that at the time. So I was just going to ask you, what are your practices? What you think the flashpoints are going to be identified as in 30 or 40 years' time? What do you think is going to be important, or what's going on might herald a big and thoroughly desirable social change, for example, because not much seems to happen with land ownership. Basically, we don't own the countryside, and a tiny percentage of the country seems to own it from the work of Guy Sharpshaw. Anyway, so that's my question. What the flashpoint is going to be as we look back on all your work and your practice, do you think?
Do you have a particular one of these people that you like to get?
Well, I know, I don't want to pick one because it's unfair, really. Perhaps the people who have been more embedded in the countryside and in difficult situations with accommodation and just getting nice together, for example, a lot of that cause line is massively feudal system of landowning we still have in this country, which excludes vast numbers of people from ever being able to get a stake in anything, really.
Any volunteers? I'm going to pick on you, Jenny.
Yeah, okay. Well, I love trespassing. So hopefully I would love to say it's examples of people barging in when they're not wanted and finding a way to live. I was going to say with your work, I read this great book, I think it's called The Little Book of Trespass, which is basically, I recommend anyone to read it, but it's basically what rights you're entitled to, even when you're walking on a piece of private land in the UK. And the rivers are particularly interesting because you're allowed, or in some parts of the country, you're allowed to row down the middle of a river, but you're not allowed to stop on either banks. So hopefully it's lots of people finding really inventive ways to sneak past our feudal owners. I'd like to see hopefully more of that, but realistically it's limited budgets, limited access, limited time with people. I've seen a great loss of group photography. That used to be such a great art, even in commercial work. You get all your actors together with a TV show, and now they're all photoshopped together because no one's got the time to be in the same place at the same time. So thank you all for coming out today and being all together. So I don't know. So it's probably just tough conditions all round, and we're going to look back in 40 years and be like, oh my god, we were so free, we had a whole 2 minutes with someone, and now we've only got 5 seconds. So yeah, you look like you're going to say something, Jermaine. I'm going to give this to you.
For me, it's probably going to be look back at a time where there was a real point where we go in a certain direction or another direction, and what are we going to do what are we going to do now? And I think that's going to be what I'm going to look back on. People are going to look back on what happened in this period, where there was this political shift, where there was this shift with economics. Like, what are we actually going to do to be able to try and deal with these things? I know, like, we have America and look what's going on there, and how friends of mine are finding their land rights being taken away, and then, the land that was designated to be protected is now just being ripped apart through political rhetoric. And what I guess here will be maybe saying this was maybe the point where it changed and maybe a few years ago. So I feel that's, for me, going to be a big thing.
There's one thing that I'd like to happen is there are groups trying to give the land the kind of same legal rights. So there's a river, I can't remember where the river is actually, it would be really helpful if I could, but it's recently just been granted the same legal rights as a business. I've forgotten the correct legal terminology, and I know that there's a group in Frome hoping to get that for the River Frome as well. And there's a river in New Zealand that's been granted it. And I'd actually love, that's what I hope that we'll see, is more of these spaces being protected and that being enshrined in law. So, and hopefully that would protect in some way us from what's happening in the States with the national park. So that's what I'd like to see would happen with the land.
Is there another question about that? Hi.
Jermaine, I was going to ask Jermaine, just the idea of making the work, because you talked about belonging, and I know the work was kind of lots of composites we talked about. But I was curious about whether making the work was therapeutic or was an attempt for everybody to feel not feeling. Jermaine.
I'm going to get a mic. Yeah, I mean, it is a part of the work. As I said, I have an interest in, the sensory aspects of photography, which has been talked a lot about recently, of font materiality, what we bring to it, isn't just what we look, but also what it can make us feel, what it makes us see. As a personal kind of thing of being therapeutic, personally I didn't find it therapeutic because I have to deal with all the shit I've had to deal with for years. So it's not always that therapeutic. I'm having to look at things which are quite personally painful. To be born in a country when sometimes something happens where you feel unstable within that space, of if you belong or if you're part of, which definitely happened during the Windrush. Affair is quite a crap word to use. But basically, yeah, so, if you're making any work that has some kind of personal relationship to you, then it can be a form of also therapeutic as well, like you said, but also be triggering. I always say to my students to do be kind to yourself when you're making a particular kind of work is really important. To be mindful not just of who you're working with, but how it affects you emotionally. I think all of us, by the way we work, and what I want to say today is that it's a really beautiful day because it shows photography in its rich complexities, and it's not going like, these old arguments with secular and other artists going, you've got to do it like this, and you've got to do it like this. No, it's a space that, I don't always agree with other people's practices, but that's not for me to say they shouldn't exist. It's part of that, it's part of the conversation, it's about what it should be about. So for me, I'm very much having these conversations about this idea of opacity and about actually difference and having to deal with that and actually accept these different points of view. And Kirsty said it as well, having these different narratives in the spaces is actually really important. For me personally, a polarised time now.
Any other questions from now? Well, yeah, come back.
No,
Yeah.
I don't need the mic. I just wanted to say the wonderful thing about Jermaine is the bringing in the other practitioners, because there are not very many people who unselfishly do that and invite that conversation and relate it, and so I commend it.
But it's what it's about, isn't it? It's about us having a dialogue. I mean, I remember discovered your work, Kirsty, and obviously because it's from about Tipton, so it's where I'm from, but also not about that, having this journey that you've had within photography and within yourself, and I just thought that was amazing. I love photography. I hate photography as well at times, but I love it. I love that here we get to discover new practices and work and people's work I've not seen before and different approaches. So for me, it's about, I get a lot of amplification anyway, so for me, helping, trying to get, for all of us were talking about the other day, that's what it's about, is voices. Why I'm into bread, so let's just talk about bread. I mean, that'd be boring, wouldn't it? It's like, talk about everybody's work, it's good. And it's difficult, I'm sure it's difficult for all of us, financially, I don't know, emotionally and everything. It's a really difficult thing to be part of. Sometimes wonder why we do it. But we do it, don't we? So, I mean, that's what it's about, this festival as well. The work that's been put into here by all these people to get people's work out there and have a conversation.
Any other questions? Phil?
Yes. Hello, right. Yes, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for actually answering my email, coming along and actually taking the time to talk in Frome. I'm going to sound like Keir Starmer in the Toolmaker reference he always says, but I am from Frome. I grew up very working class. And there weren't these opportunities in Frome when I was younger.
You were a toolmaker?
I wasn't a toolmaker. My dad wasn't a toolmaker, he was a tyre fitter, actually. I'm going to just use that as a constant reference now. But yeah, I think it's really nice to kind of come full circle, come back to Frome and get a lot of people in the room and just talk about photography, but also kind of some of these challenges as well. And I hope that people can go out and share those experiences, essentially. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the speakers.
Thank you.